So how does refusing to forget say this spate of racial violence was triggered? Well, they say Anglos flooded the Rio Grande Valley when the railroads came in the early 1900s, and that these Anglos didn't assimilate to the predominantly Mexican culture. They bought up land, driving up land values and property taxes, driving Hispanics off of their own land. This created tensions, they say, and that little Mexican Revolution thing, it simply exacerbated the tensions the Anglos already created. The Mexican Revolution, they say, provided Texas Anglos, quote, with a rationale for suppression of remaining Mexican-American political rights. Now, that's wafer thin as far as context goes. If you want to understand and explain something as complex as a race war, you got to look beyond 2 decades of interactions. You got to start at the start and try to understand all sides. Anglos formed colonies in Spanish Texas and Mexican Texas in the 1820s. Texas separated from Mexico in 1836, and Mexico, for obvious reasons, was not a friendly neighbor. So Texas becomes one of the United States. Mexico, still not a friendly neighbor. The United States and Mexico had a war. Mexico lost. It ceded a large swath of territory to the United States and was paid $15 million for that lost territory. When you hear we didn't cross the border crossed us, that's an elegant reference to how some Mexicans suddenly found themselves Americans one day instead. In the wake of the war and fixing of long disputed borders, many border Tejanos occupied land that was backed by Spanish and Mexican grants. To prevent land speculators and ranch consolidators from taking those lands, Texas created the Borland Commission in 1850 to keep Tejanos on their lands. 2 commissioners and an attorney go from border town to border town, gathering evidence from citizens about their land grants and claims, how long they'd lived there, improvements, all of that. And despite the reticence of many Tejano landowners to meet with the commission, the majority of these claims submitted were eventually validated, either by the legislature or the courts. Of the 100 submitted, only 24 were never adjudicated. Despite the Borland Commission's efforts to protect these new Texas citizens, there was still a cultural divide at the border. It just wouldn't erupt until later. Then Porfirio Diaz came to power. He threw open the Mexican economy to investments from foreigners, specifically Americans. But this was too much too soon for Mexicans for whom the war of 30 years earlier was still a very raw spot. American investors were using their capital to reopen abandoned mining operations and other businesses, and they were making money hand over fist. But Mexicans were employed as low-wage laborers. This was an irritant. The Mexican economy boomed, widening this chasm between the rich and the poor. The longer Diaz stayed in power, the wider the chasm grew, and the angrier the Mexicans got, both at Diaz and at the American capitalists. The first tipping point occurred in 1891 when the Garza Revolution attempted to overthrow Diaz. Garza recruited for his revolution right here in Texas. The insurrection lasted just 2 years, but it served to foreshadow the large-scale revolution that was moving like a freight train towards Texas and Mexico. Captain John Burke of the 3rd U.S. Cavalry was among the U.S. soldiers sent to help quell the Garza revolt. He wrote presciently of the difficulties of guerrilla warfare and the dangers posed to innocents by revolutionaries who blended in with the population. Writes Burke, quote, "The difficulty of the task performed may be inferred from the fact that the population in this valley, the Rio Grande Valley, is essentially Mexican. The language, dress, customs, the weights and measures, money used, everything about them may be put down as Spanish. Therefore, it is almost an impossibility to separate a revolutionist from one of the ordinary inhabitants." So opposition swelled against Diaz's pro-American policies, and factions began to form up, each supporting a different replacement for Diaz, some supporting one another on a Monday, but violently opposing each other on a Tuesday. Revolutionary raids led by the Magonistas in 1907 and 1908 saw the U.S. sending troops and rangers to the border, and Mexico sending troops and rurales, or Mexican rangers, to monitor the border. Revolutionaries and opportunistic marauders engaged in a smattering of raids. To squash these raids, Mexican troops and rurales, for their part, meted out summary justice. They took no prisoners, Even if someone waved a white flag, they were executed anyway. The bodies were left out to rot and to send a message. And all of that is what led to the Mexican Revolution and a race war. A couple of wars involving Texas, a population angry at a pro-American president, a Mexican population resentful of Americans living in their midst, revolutionaries preparing to overthrow Diaz. Refusing to Forget offers a simplistic view that a race war in 1910 came from some Anglo newcomers refusing to assimilate with the Mexican culture of the borderlands.
But it wasn't a race war. Rather, it was a guerrilla uprising by Texas Mexican landowners, right, who were finding themselves displaced from their social positioning. So it wasn't explicitly, as it were, about killing white people, but that's what the economics of it were.
The race war, according to them, was caused by oppressive Anglos disrespecting people of Mexican descent. It's so intellectually dishonest to omit the resentment that festered among the Mexican population before that, or violence they committed against Anglos. In reality, decades of resentment on the Mexican side played just as big a role as anything else.